All right. Thanks so much, Mr. Campbell, for being here today. We'll get started with the first question. Could you please tell us your name and your role in the community?
Hi, my name is Nathan Campbell. I am currently a high school teacher at May River High School. I teach high school government. I also have started the youth and government programs, the Model United Nations program, the mock trial programs, and the academic World Quest programs, trying to give kids an opportunity and see a lot of different experiences that you can experience in a social studies curriculum. So I've done that along with a lot of other odd jobs there at the school, but for the most part, that's what I do during the day. And then at night, obviously, I'm pretty active in the community trying to talk about what we're going to be talking about today, which is voting rights education.
Awesome. Okay, so we're here to discuss voting rights, just like you said. So let me ask you right off the bat, why is it important to vote?
Well, I think that when everybody asks the question, why is it important to vote, that is a very standard question. And sometimes you get those standard responses like every vote counts or your vote matters, right? But if you're not voting, what you're doing is you're effectively handing the power structure to somebody else. And you're saying, hey, make decisions for me. And if their vote's not educated any more than yours is, which if I was a person, I would think no other person's vote is any more important than my own. So why wouldn't I be educated about it? And when we talk about voting rights education, I think one of the things about having an educated vote and exercising that educated vote is knowing who you're voting for, knowing what those positions are that you're voting for, and then what are the issues that people are running on, because that's one of the things that kind of sets people apart, because knowing somebody's a good person is not going to get effective government and governance done. And so one of the things that I think we're learning a lot as a country is that voting is becoming more and more important, and you kind of see that now more than ever, especially in the last few months with the election.
That's awesome. Okay, so let's go back to the Constitution of the United States. When the Constitution was adopted, who was allowed to vote? And can you give us a timeline of when those who were initially denied voting rights finally had them granted?
Well, voting in a representative democracy is the most important tool in order to instruct your government on how you want it run. And so when our country began, it was only white male landowners that were that had the ability to vote. And in those first few years of our country, we're looking at around 6% of the whole population is who were eligible to vote. And so our story of a country is really a story of enfranchisement, but we've had a lot of bumps along the way. And I think a lot of those bumps kind of culminated right after the Civil War. And when we, as a country, decided, hey, what we were doing wrong, and we need to incorporate people and their vote into what we're doing. And so you saw in 1870, you saw a lot of people win elections. And here in South Carolina, you saw a man named Joseph Rainey in 1870 in the first district. He actually bounced from Georgetown to Charleston and back and forth, but eventually ran in Georgetown in 1870 and won along with a lot of African Americans in the South because of African American participation. During Reconstruction, the African American participation was at almost at an all-time high. And when we talk about all-time high, it went down from there. And it was because African Americans were starting to get into these roles in leadership, it scared white leadership. And so what ended up happening was a backlash to that, and then the eventuality of working into Jim Crow. And so through the years, our story has really been about enfranchisement. And so our Constitution and leading up into that Civil War era is really when we can kind of look at our history and go, something happened, and it happened with Jim Crow. And so, again, in the 1900s, when you started to see some of these backlashes, you started seeing participation kind of struggle. And so, I think that kind of leads us, into some of those issues that kind of, were holding back African American voters.
That's great. I think that's really important, especially because it reinforces the fact that as voters, we all need to keep continuing to fight for that right because it wasn't earned easily and there was a lot of work that went into it. So I think that's really important. So next is during the most of the 20th century, we know that a lot of tactics were used to prevent black people from voting, like what we were talking about. So could you go into some of those specifically?
Yeah, and I think those kind of evolve over time too. So when we talk about those, we're going to talk about those right around the 1900s because that disenfranchisement really starts with that Jim Crow, like we were just talking about. And there were two main areas. And what white people did and what white leadership did at that time was they looked at where African Americans were struggling. And where they were struggling was where areas where white people had held them back financially through slavery and education through public education. You saw in the South, they were not going to incorporate public education until very recently in our history. And so, especially for African Americans. So, what they did was they incorporated two tools, and those tools were poll taxes, right? Oh, these elections are now getting to be expensive. We need people to pay a poll tax if you want to vote. So, obviously, African Americans could not pay these poll taxes, so less and less of them register to vote and turn out to vote. What you see also is the idea of a literacy test. And many of the kids that go through my youth and government program get to see the Louisiana State Literacy Test because one of the things is we do talk about the importance of voting in our organization and our club and in the classroom because we want, with there being less and less importance on civics education, I think now is a big a time as any to kind of get kids back involved in who was fighting, why were they fighting, and then why are we still fighting for this right to vote? Because if you're looking at it, some of the successes in the 2020 election were because of the African American community and the right to vote. So that disenfranchisement that started in the early 1900s kind of goes through the generation, but it evolves over time. But those two main issues start creeping up in the South and really hurting participation, registration, and voter turnout. So those are where it starts, and then I think it eventually evolves into the solution, which I think we're going to talk about here in the next question.
That's great. That's really important. So yeah, the next question is the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a landmark piece of legislation, obviously. So could you maybe tell us a little bit more about it, including the role that the Black community played and marginalized people play in having the act signed into law? Excuse me.
Well, it's really the activism of the Black community that really started this. I mean, if you look everywhere along the way in white leadership, there is a Black leader there trying to push them towards the Voting Rights Act. And so, obviously, with the Kennedy assassination and then Johnson in 1965 being pushed, it really was an event like the March to Selma and the late John Lewis. And that activism and that putting yourself in the fight is why this is very important. And we see those images now when we look back because we just saw John Lewis's life celebrated in the news recently. So we all saw those images from Selma brought back up during a summer when we're having to stare at images of George Floyd. So the activism you see right now and that vibrant turnout that you saw it nationwide in the African American community, especially in the cities. And especially because if you look a few weeks ago or a few days ago in the state of Georgia, that voter turnout is something really to be astonished by. But it was because of that push of the African American community and activists. When we're talking about the student nonviolent, and we're talking about the Southern Law, all of the organizations along the way that Fannie Lou Hamer and what she did for business opportunities and trying to build the African American community from a business standpoint. And we see those same leaders in our community today, like Bridget Frazier, trying to start in incorporating the Gullah market. And that's something I go to usually monthly, even during the pandemic. because again, I'm trying to support local businesses and local community, just like a lot of other people are, especially during these tough times. And so, but the importance of the Voting Rights Act was because it did things like banned these things from Jim Crow, like literacy tests and poll taxes. And these are the types of things that eventually moved their way through. But it was a fight, and it's a constant fight. And so these things keep creeping back up. And so when we talk about the Voting Rights Act, it really was that activism, and it was from the African American community. And you see those parallels to today. If we want things to change, it has to be from the marginalized groups that do that, the impoverished people of our society that are white, Black, Hispanic, everybody along that spectrum, but also the other marginalized communities standing up saying, hey, this is what's happened to us. You need to speak of your experience in order to educate others to it. So that's why a lot of what I try to do is research out there, looking at, hey, I've been researching education, Voting Rights Act, the voting rights education for a while, just because, again, I'm in education. I want these kids to be participants in their government, not get taken advantage of by their government, or get taken advantage of by the people that vote. And in certain areas, we see where turnout really affects all races, presidential, and your statewide races, and even those local races. We had a few local races that were very close this year, but again, by more participation of our African American community and our Hispanic community and our Asian American community, these are communities that will then be able to sit at the table like a Joe Biden administration is trying to do right now. And if you see his cabinet appointees, you're seeing a lot of Hispanic and African American representation, but overly qualified too. These people should have had these positions a while ago. And it takes a strong leader in order to put people in these positions that they know are going to fight for their community and for the good of everyone. And so I really think that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is that catalyst that gets us up to today, because now we see some of this stuff start to creep back in. And so that's where I, again, have done a lot of research into these recent ideas of voter suppression.
I think that's really great, and I think about how we just saw Georgia turn blue, which I never thought that would happen. I mean, the strides that so many people like Stacey Abrams made, like we talk about the Black community and how important and how vital the Black community was to flipping Georgia and ultimately towards getting Joe Biden elected and so much. So I think that's a really great point. So the next question: what measures are used today to discourage voting or to politically disadvantage some certain populations?
Well, and I'm glad you brought up Stacey Abrams, because and we see that model in Georgia of what can go wrong. In 2018, just 2 years ago, we saw what went wrong. We saw a Secretary of State make sure that he took machines out of polling places where African American, large African American communities live, in Fulton County, and suppress the voter turnout in cities. Now, obviously, Miss Abrams' organization, Fair Fight, works very hard to go in the ground and make sure everybody's registered, and they make these things events. So really, I am impressed with in what she's been able to do and what she has done for other areas like our area and in South Carolina. She's done a lot in Texas as well. And so getting people registered to vote. But if you studied any of what they're doing, it is a systematic idea, because in 2013, what ended up happening is there was a Supreme Court case, and it was called Shelby v. Holder. The Shelby v. Holder case was a simple case where they challenged, that was overturned. So the Voting Rights Act is now null and void. And so now you see some of these southern states that had to get the approval of the Justice Department and hoops that they needed to go through. Now no more hoops, and we see what happens in Georgia because of purging of the rolls was one of the things. And so one of the things that I like to talk about is this idea of, oh, in Ohio, they did this as well, right before the 2016 election. And it's where they send a ID. You haven't voted in a while, so they send a card to your house. You don't answer that card, they take your name off the list. So when you show up to vote, you're not registered to vote. And so what you're seeing is and what this does is by purging these roles, because people move a lot as well, so they re-register. And this was affecting our minority community, but our impoverished community as well, across the board. And so long lines. If I work, I cannot do a long line on the day of the election. So what you're seeing in a perfect storm of 2020 is all these southern states say, hey, we will do mail-in balloting. So a lot of organizers like Stacey Abrams said, oh, really? So she went around, took all the names that she'd registered to vote, and then sent them information saying, hey, here's how you get your ballot at your house. And so voter rights education, the woman is beyond her year in voter rights education. She understands that if I want people to participate in the process, they have to understand the process. And that's why we all understand that right now, when we see things go on in the Capitol that might make us sad, we need to think about whose votes are they trying to marginalize? They're trying to marginalize the African American community's votes because they stepped up, and that's why they think it's fake. They think it's fake because they're like, wait, and they also hear rhetoric saying that it's fake. So why not believe it, right? But we know better because we saw the turnout, and we know that the votes were legitimate. And so this is kind of fun for us in that now we get to look at democracy work. And because we're getting rid of long lines, which happened because of those mail-in ballots, the purging of the rolls, well, we're re-registering people to vote. When you take them off, all right, cool. Well, we'll remind people to re-register to vote. We'll be in their communities throwing events and doing those types of things that bring community together. Especially think about when the pandemic is over, right? And we're all going to be able to join up again and do these types of things. And we're going to obviously do them very big because we've been stuck in our houses for multiple years. And so, but again, that the other kind of things that lead to voter suppression are these new ideas like voter ID laws. That obviously affects the minority community. If you actually look in South Carolina, the driver's license laws that I was just talking to my students about the other day, I think those disenfranchise poor people, because now I have to take a class. I have to take a class to get my ID so then I can learn how to drive by that time. What's going on? Like, I don't understand this. So for kids your age, it doesn't make any sense to me. It was one age I could do this, the next age I could do that. I didn't have to pay someone $300 to take a class to get my driver's license early. Again, I was a poor kid. I grew up with two parents that were school teachers. So my 3 pairs of shoes that I owned for 4 years, I was pretty happy about those 3 pairs. They got me those 4 years. But again, and I think that leads us into the last things are very obvious now that we've heard about them. It's the day of the week. Why are we not having a holiday, a national holiday? Because obviously people, and especially in the minority communities, cannot take off for work during these days. We need a national holiday. There's only one party right now that's talking about that. And I'm glad that they now have the majority. So I hope they follow through with that, because a Voting Rights Act probably needs to have John Lewis's name on it. And I really would like to see a passage of a Voting Rights Act, because that national holiday needs to happen. But the last thing that needs to be banned in all 50 states is the art, and I do call it an art because they've made it an art in South Carolina, of gerrymandering. And they do it based upon race. You can look back to the 2010 maps. I've been researching. This is the one area that I would call my pet project, because I see in African American, predominantly African American communities, especially in our community of Bluffton, if you look, there's a jagged line that goes right through. And if you look, the minorities live on both sides of that line. It's a technique that they used in 2010 called cracking. It's where they crack a minority group into smaller groups to then break up the voting power of that minority group. And so that needs to be banned. And I've been kind of studying this ever since Arnold Schwarzenegger started talking about it as governor of California. So I really hope that our state legislators no longer get to draw their own lines and pick their voters, because I really think that is a bad practice. And so I'm really hoping, because again, that's disenfranchising the African American community and Latino community here in Bluffton. And so I've seen it firsthand. I see it in the Senate seats as well. And so that's one of the things I've been speaking out about. And again, I hope that we can find solutions to these new problems that have now come up.
Yeah, I think that's all really important, and especially going back to, all these methods that were taken to go against the Black community during voting. I mean, my dad and I attended a Black Voters Matter event, maybe like a year and a half ago, and they talked about all of the methods that Georgia used during the 2018 Stacey Abrams election, and I mean, my jaw was on the floor the whole time. I could not believe all these things that they were doing. And I just think about how, like, when we talk about systemic racism, how deeply rooted it is, and it's not over. Like, we can see in so many different areas. It's just jaw-droppingly surprising how awful it is. So I think that's a really good thing that we need to be talking about more and bringing more attention to. So that's good.
And again, that started this year. That really started this year. If you look in June, when the George Floyd situation, that lit the match. And so we really need to continue to build upon these things and educate. I think that is the one catalyst in this whole thing, is people are now being educated to what really goes on out there between different communities, between law enforcement and communities, between vote. I mean, again, we've seen it in 2018. We saw voter suppression to our faces, and we saw a woman go, no, I think I'm going to take care of that now. All right. So instead of just backing away and not doing anything, which would have been, one option, she took another option, which was, I'm going to go fight for this. I'm not going to run for anything. And a lot of people speculated that. Was she going to run for president? And no, she decided she's going to fix Georgia. She's going to fix home. That is a very commendable person right there.
Yes.
And so I like that we have a lot of leaders like Jamie Harrison down here in the South that took on Lindsey Graham and gave him a fight. And he was worried. He's calling all of his friends and he's spending money. And guess what? He's got 6 years. And if he doesn't live up to it, then I cannot wait to see the African American community participation in 6 years, especially if they keep fighting for this next 4. And so I'm really going to be hopeful for what we see in the future if we can increase that participation.
I couldn't agree more. So, going back to our next question, so could you talk to us a little bit more about the battle for voting rights in the age of mass incarceration?
Yeah, so this is something I've actually started to study recently, just because, so obviously in the 15th Amendment, there was a servitude issue, which means like, if I put you back in jail, then I can take your voting rights from you. So what ended up happening is you saw a lot of African Americans get incarcerated during this time after Reconstruction and the beginnings of Jim Crow, all the way through. So now all the way through that we can talk about. There are some great documentaries out there, and the things that we did along the way, obviously when it came to drugs and weapons and those types of things, those move along the way. But what ends up happening is the African American community disproportionately over the years becomes a larger group in prisons. And so that's one thing in mass incarceration. We are taking away a voting community. And then when they go back to their states are in charge of giving their voting rights back. And we saw in the state of Florida where the Floridians there voted overwhelmingly to give voting rights back to rehabilitated felons. And that is very, that shows, even in a state that has voted presidentially conservatively, they still are going to do things to help people if it is the right issue. And I think that is one thing that we can look to Florida and say, hey, now some other states need to step up. So again, fighting for these things. Other states need to step up and take a hard look at themselves. South Carolina, we are not immune to taking a hard look at ourselves. Obviously, we've seen with the Charleston 9 shooting and a lot of the protest movement that has sprung up. There is an idea here that South Carolina is a little bit different than the rest of the South. And if we can kind of spread that idea that we have here in the Low Country, of that idea of respecting everybody, liberty and freedom, again, I think this will be a lot less tenuous place to live in, because I think that we have a lot of great people here. We have a very diverse community, and when we get out of this pandemic, hopefully, with the right movement by a president, then we'll be able to see some real tangible results.
Yeah, I agree. I think we have a lot of potential here in South Carolina, and I'm really excited to see what we do in the future, especially after this pandemic. So, what were your thoughts on voter turnout for the recent presidential election, and what did you find particularly encouraging, and what concerned you?
Well, okay, so if I was to pick like one word, I would say it was promising. Meaning, in South Carolina, we didn't really see the voter turnout they saw around the rest of the country. We saw Republican voter turnout at an all-time high. Now, we understand why that is in South Carolina. We are not immune to that. But I think one of the ideas that we have gone away from is that registering people to vote in the hard to get to areas of the state, the parts that aren't connected immediately to an interstate. And all those parts in South Carolina are predominantly African American. And so we as a nation need to kind of take a look at ourselves and say, hey, where is our voter turnout weak? But as a country, wow, our voter turnout in cities was at an all-time high. But again, we had some of those easy restrictions of we can mail in our ballot. A lot of these states are going to fight against those ideas. We need to fight for it, making it easier to vote. And so when I say promising, it's because we're at an inflection point in our country. If we can get a new Voting Rights Act passed and do some of these things that are going to lay the groundwork for the next 10 years and increasing participation, but also increasing voter education, right? This is where I can go. One of the cool things was being a school teacher is I actually got to like educate a lot of people in the recent election when I ran for office. The 3 days before the filing date, nobody was running for office. I decided to run because no one was going to do it. And it would have been 16 years that nobody had a choice on the ballot. So I decided to run. I got 25,000 votes, the most ever by a Democrat for a state Senate seat in this county's history. And it was because we're speaking to ideas, right? Those ideas of get as many people registered to vote. We have great people in our community, not just Bridget Frazier, but you've got people on the island registering people to vote, like Michael Lewis, right? And he's all the way from Hardyville all the way to the island. And him and I, we went and we tried to talk to people where we knew they were hurting in food pantry lines and volunteered time to kind of talk to people to say, hey, if you really want to change this, this is how it starts. But again, making sure you follow up with those people and doing good things for them, because now we see more than ever. That's why I say promising. We see that our country is divided, but I see a lot of good people that want to work together. And for me, I just want to make sure that those people that don't want to work with anybody, those aren't the people that I necessarily am going to want to be around. Because again, these are the people we're going to see these factions throughout time. And so I feel like promising is a good word to say, but we did see some weaknesses in areas. And I really feel if we get a good groundwork game going, like they've seen in Georgia, like they've seen in Pennsylvania, like they've seen in Texas, you're going to see a lot closer races. I'm really anxious to see what Texas looks like, I think in 2024, when the Texas seats up and you've got a lot of capable people in Texas ready to run. because that demographic is changing. South Carolina is changing. We may be adding another House seat with all of the growth that we've seen in our county. Our county is kind of fueling this idea of growth in between Savannah and Charleston. And so Bluffton is really booming. And so we need to work on jobs. We need to work on our economy. But again, promising means that if we have a lot of people move in here, it could change the demographic. So if we have high African American and Hispanic turnout, you may see that that minority becomes a majority in the next few years. And so if we get participation from all of those communities and that younger generation, you're going to see a change to this area. And I think a change that involves a lot of environmental protection and criminal justice reform. I think that, that's kind of what Bluffton wants to be. We want to be the leader of the state. We look at ourselves as like, hey, we've got some pretty good ideas down here. We've got some pretty good people too, but we just need to get these people involved. So when I say promising, we need these people involved in running for office, because the reason I ran this year was to get people involved in the process. And luckily for me, I've had a lot of people reach out in the last few weeks saying, hey, you took a shot. I think I'm going to take a shot next time. And I say, thank you, because all I want to see are names on the ballot, and then let the people decide. So that's why I say promising, but we still need to keep on it. And so I hope that over the next few years, we can really do that.
That's great. I think, like you were saying, we have made great strides, but there's certainly work to be done. And I know over the summer, going to protests and getting to hear from people right here in Bluffton, where I grew up all my life, it's really inspiring to see all the work everyone's doing and how we're trying to move forward and do better for everybody. Because this all these political issues are affecting us all, so we really need to have a say and fight for what really matters. So.
I think this summer definitely, I think you're right on. This summer definitely showed us how special of a community we live in.
Mhm.
That during a pandemic, we're all out there doing, and we would have saw larger numbers if we weren't in a pandemic.
Right.
And that was inspiring to see those large of numbers
Right.
from this area.
Yeah.
We are changing, and it is because we're getting people. We have that native island population, but we're also building a very diverse community around it. And I see it right now being a high school teacher in the largest high school in the district that is growing the fastest. We just opened up 21 classrooms. So the people are moving here, and they're moving here because they like the way we think, and they like the way we do things. And so it's very promising, but let's stay on it.
Yep, I agree. So I think that's a perfect segue to our next question. So given the current state of things, where do we go from here?
Well, obviously, I'd like to see a John Lewis Voting Rights Act. I'd love to see that in the first few days of session, but maybe that takes a while because there are some more pressing issues right now when we talk about COVID and those types of things. But a Voting Rights Act, I hope they get around to that, because banning gerrymandering, fixing these ideas of long lines, and then getting a lot more voting machines out there in these precincts that are larger precincts, to make sure we don't have lines when we go back to this, because you're going to see in a lot of southern states they're not going to want to expand it to mail-in voting, because they're all afraid of what happened in Georgia. Georgia has now scared the South into thinking, oh, well, we have to suppress voter. Well, let's find a way to do it now. And so now we see what we're going to have to come up against. If we don't have a Voting Rights Act, that's going to be where some of these southern states can get away from purging rolls. We need to make rules for these things on a federal level. And if we can't, then we need to amend, we need to amend our Constitution. And I know those are big asks, and those probably won't be done immediately and would have to be done with supermajority. So we'll see what's going to happen in the next few years. I'm very anxious as a political scientist to see where we go from here. But I really think when it comes to where we go from here, it involves voter education, voter rights education, getting out there, getting in the community, and then getting these people understanding this is what I'm voting for. This is what this position does, and kind of talking about local elections, because local elections have the most influence over your lives. And for most of us, we do not know who our local mayors are. When I ask the kids these questions, I want them to know these things. And that's why I make these discussion points in my classroom, because I think educating kids to doing it and then making sure these organizations get into these communities. I think one of the biggest things we need to work on is getting the African American community with these voting rights organizations that are going to go into the community and actually register and educate, because that is the biggest hurdle, is getting in the community and doing good work. But again, I really think that the civics, if we go back to more civics education in our schools, if we have more of an educated public, but I really think that voter rights education is going to be our easiest way to do it and our cheapest way. All we have to have are teachers out there teaching it, but we have to get more civics in the schools, which is what we've taken out over the last 30 years. When I talk to people your parents' age and above, that's one of the things they say. Oh, there's no civics in high school anymore. And I'm like, well, there's government, but that doesn't really teach anything. So I want to teach more civics, and that's kind of where I focus my government teaching as well, is so then they'll understand the process, understand what they're getting into, understand what those branches do and how it affects their lives. So they know why they're voting for Congress, and that being almost or just as important as a presidential vote. But we all really consider, we have these local elections that happen every year. And so we really need to be prepared and in the custom of doing it. And so we need to get people out there and educate them on that. But I think was that it? Or was there one more?
We have one more, if that's okay.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I think that's really important. And I know since I took your YIG class in freshman year of Youth and Government, I know I learned so much, and I wish every student could have the opportunity to take that class, because I learned so much about the branches that I didn't know, and I just wish that everyone could have that, because I learned so much, and it was really important, especially with the next few years we had with this election and everything. It's even
Yeah.
more important.
It's been an interesting time to be a teacher as well as a student.
Definitely. What's your advice to young people who have witnessed the contentious political climate of our country and are worried if we'll ever truly live up to Dr. King's message?
Well, and I think, like I said, we're at an inflection point in our country. Which way are we going to go? Are we going to go towards that divisive nature that we've seen the past few years, ever since Barack Obama got elected? Or are we going to kind of unite and say, hey, bye, fringes, we need to unite as a country, and we all have very common beliefs, and we need to start electing people that can work with the other side and have results? Because again, we see that the priorities of our local legislators don't match up with our local communities. So right now, if they're talking about things like COVID relief, those are good things. But our state legislature is talking about abortion bans and those type of things. So when we look at it, are we living up to Dr. King's dream? No. Can we? Eventually, but we need to take those steps, and it's not going to be easy. We're going to have some tough conversations, and those are the things that I enjoyed having during the election. Whether I believe that the Confederate flag should be anywhere near our state, and not being originally from South Carolina and growing up in West Virginia, and moving to South Carolina and being offended when I saw it hanging from the state capitol. And that to me was a visceral, like, what's going on here? And my father saying, son, you don't live in the North anymore. And so having to learn, education is our way out. So the next generation is really, if they're involved, the last time voter participation for that generation, the millennial generation, or that 18 to 24, when they got high turnout, when was the last time that happened? The 1960s and the civil rights movement. Obviously, the involvement of 18 to 24-year-olds, and then those people are active their entire lives. And so that's what we really need. We need this new youthful revolution. And if we actually get voter participation, that's why I'm trying to get automatic voter registration. You need to fight for these voting rights issues. So then it makes it easier to participate. If it's easier to participate, more people participating, that is one thing that you will see collective voice and collective change happen. It happens easier when you have more people participating. So I think if this next generation actually, that's my not advice to the next generation, but I have that much faith in the next generation that I see that kind of energy and enthusiasm that we see from seeing things like George Floyd. We have visceral reactions to that, and that kind of thing that we need to push us in trying to be more activisms or activists and do more things that get ourselves out there in the community and kind of say, hey, we're united in this. And so fighting for equal rights only happens through voting and voting participation. So this whole equation kind of comes back to this. Are we going to, if we participate and we do the things, we have a lot of good people in our community. Now let's utilize them, right? So let's go talk and have those tough conversations with our friends and say, yeah, you're going to run for town council. You're going to run for county council. You're going to run for coroner. You're going to run for every position up and down the ballot. Get your friends there, because that sparks the debate. That's the conversation you want to have. Because you'll see that this year we had more Democratic candidates than in the last 20 or 30 years up and down the ballot in South Carolina in a deep red area. And that's because guess what? Times they are a changing, and we need to change with them. And so I'm excited to see what we do in the future, but it all starts with that 18 to 24 generation. We need them participating in the process right now, getting signed up, registered to vote, and we need people out there being activists for voting rights, trying to make sure that we get automatic voter registration and those types of things that are same day registration, the things that are going to help participation and make sure that we have secure and respected elections. So I think Dr. King will be proud if that next generation kind of follows his footsteps and says, hey, look what he did. Look at all the change that he was able to accomplish. I think our generation can do that same thing, but we need leaders out there doing it. And so that's why your generation is more important, I think, than anything. Than we're looking to you guys for the future, because enough of our generation has screwed it up. So now we need you guys to kind of come in and help us. And again, you're the 18 to 24 voter participation. We didn't see that increase that we thought we were going to get. We saw it from the African American community, though. So we really need to kind of harp on our good, make sure we understand our bad, and work towards, an even better future.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I couldn't agree more. And I know talking to, teachers and parents, they all say, they weren't that involved in politics when they were younger. But I mean, for me, when the 2016 election, I was in middle school, and then I've had to educate myself because of how chaotic, let's just say, use that word, things
Mm-hmm.
have been in the past years. So I think it was really a wake up call for everybody, not just adults, to everyone, that we really need to be politically engaged. So I think that your message was great.
Yeah, and if you're not politically engaged, then you just parrot whatever you hear, whether that's a
Right,
major media source or a parent,
right,
right? So if you don't educate yourself, that's the one thing I try to tell all my students is, hey, come up with your own opinion. You know what your parents is, they'll tell you, right? Even if you don't ask for it sometimes, right? My mom still tells me her opinion, right? So those are the kind of things that we all need to understand that, again, I really feel like the participation of your generation, if you get out there,
Yeah,
going to shake things up.
I totally agree. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Campbell. Your insight has been so helpful, and I know everyone's going to enjoy listening to this. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
And thank you. And again, this has been an awesome opportunity to be included in something like this. For me, it's an honor to even be asked to do this and to be interviewed by you. Definitely made my night. So thank you.
Of course. Thanks, Mr. Campbell.